The clock on my nightstand read 3:14 a.m. when the smell hit me. That thick, acrid stench of melting rubber and burning treated lumber that triggers a primal panic in the lizard brain of any man who has spent his life building things with his hands. By the time I stumbled out onto the front lawn, my bare feet screaming against the frost-covered grass, and the smoke searing the inside of my lungs like swallowed glass, the structure I had poured 15 years of sweat and savings into was already a towering inferno. My sanctuary, my workshop, my beautifully restored 1969 Camaro SS that I had rebuilt bolt by agonizing bolt after coming home from court every night. It was all gone in under 8 minutes, just dissolved into an orange hellscape. The battalion chief later told me it looked like a catastrophic electrical failure, but my gut and my high-definition security system screamed arson. Across the street, standing in her driveway like a specter in a silk robe, was Karenza Sterling, the president of the Oak Ridge Heights Homeowners Association, her arms folded across her chest, watching the destruction of my property not with horror, not with neighborly concern, but with the quiet, satisfied smirk of a predator watching a wounded gazelle finally collapse. That same afternoon, she walked into the municipal courthouse for her arraignment, head held high, radiating the confidence of a woman who believes the rules are just suggestions for other people, completely unaware that the judge calling her case would be the man whose life she had just tried to incinerate. My name is Elias Thorne, and 6 months ago, I was just a newly appointed municipal judge looking for a quiet place to bury the trauma of a messy divorce and 3 decades of fighting in the trenches as a public defender. I bought this house in Oak Ridge Heights not because I cared about the pretentious street names like Sovereign Way, or the neighbors who leased rovers they couldn't afford to impress people they didn't like, but because it had a detached, oversized garage that was perfect for woodworking and restoring classic muscle cars. It was supposed to be my therapy, the smell of fresh sawdust and motor oil replacing the stench of desperate plea deals and crowded holding cells. But that peace lasted exactly 72 hours before I heard the clicking of heels on my driveway. Enter Karenza Sterling. 47 years of concentrated entitlement wrapped in a polyester blazer, a former real estate agent who lost her license for administrative errors, which is polite code for fraud, and now treated the HOA presidency like it was a seat on the Supreme Court. She handed me a binder thick enough to stop a bullet, highlighting sections about garage usage, noise ordinances, and aesthetic cohesion, her eyes scanning my property with the predatory focus of a raptor looking for a weakness. She told me, with a voice that sounded like sugar-coated razor blades, that Oak Ridge Heights had standards to maintain, a subtle dig that implied I, with my grease-stained t-shirt and calloused hands, didn't quite fit the demographic profile she preferred. I tried to be reasonable, explaining that my Camaro was street legal and my woodworking only happened during permitted hours, but Karenza wasn't interested in compliance. She was interested in dominance. She started snapping photos of my mailbox, my driveway, even the specific angle of my trash cans, documenting my existence as if it were a crime scene in progress. I should have known better. I should have let my legal instincts take over right then, but I made the classic mistake of underestimating the tenacity of a petty tyrant with too much time and a little bit of power. 2 weeks later, the paper war began, starting with a violation letter on heavy, cream-colored stationery claiming unauthorized vehicle storage, which was laughable because my car was registered and insured, but bullies like Karenza bank on exhaustion. They bet on the fact that you'll just pay the fine to make them go away. When I responded with a meticulously cited letter referencing state property laws and attaching my registration, she didn't back down. She escalated, bringing in her brother, Bennett, a failed property manager who looked like he slept in his suit and smelled like cheap cologne and desperation. Together, they conducted a compliance inspection, measuring my grass with a literal ruler and claiming my welcome mat violated the community color palette, a level of absurdity that would be funny if they weren't holding the power to place a lien on my house. I watched Bennett scribbling notes while Karenza directed him like a general, pointing at my garage, asking questions about the electrical load, the structural permits, probing for a weakness in the armor of my home. That's when I realized this wasn't about enforcing rules. This was a targeted campaign to drive me out, a realization confirmed when I overheard Karenza at a block party telling a neighbor that people like him didn't understand property values, a coded phrase that made my blood boil. I started doing my own research, pulling the original permits for the house from City Hall, discovering that everything was up to code, signed off by inspectors years ago. Information I fired back at them in a letter that pointed out that filing false code violations was a misdemeanor. That letter rattled her. I could tell because the next response wasn't on the official letterhead. It was a hastily typed note warning me that my confrontational attitude would result in increased scrutiny, which is the bureaucrat's way of saying, watch your back. The harassment turned physical in subtle, deniable ways. My tires slashed while parked in my own driveway. Strange noises outside my window at 2 a.m., and Karenza is standing on the public sidewalk with a telephoto lens, photographing my garage at all hours. But the turning point, the moment the game changed from a neighborhood dispute to a criminal conspiracy, was when I caught her on my security cameras measuring the distance from my garage to the property line, not casually, but with the precision of a surveyor, focusing intensely on the main electrical panel. She wasn't looking for a code violation anymore. She was casing the joint, studying the anatomy of the building, figuring out exactly where the power entered the structure. I sat there in the dark of my study, watching the footage of her and Bennett lingering by the electrical service entrance, and the prosecutor part of my brain, the part that had been dormant since I took the bench, suddenly woke up and started screaming. They weren't planning a lawsuit. They were planning something physical, something permanent, something that required intimate knowledge of the building's vitals. Months 5 and 6 were a blur of escalating tension, with Karenza filing noise complaints with the police every time I so much as dropped a wrench, trying to weaponize the police department against me. Sergeant Miller, a good cop who was tired of wasting resources on her vendettas, tipped me off that she was on thin ice for filing false reports, giving me the first piece of leverage I needed. But Karenza, sensing her control slipping, tried to outlawyer me, sending a cease and desist order signed by Bennett, who turned out to be a lawyer in the same way a hot dog is a sandwich. Technically true, but barely passing the standard. I didn't hire a defense attorney. I represented myself, filing a massive counterclaim for harassment and Fair Housing Act violations, and used the discovery process to subpoena the HOA's financial records. That's when the trap door opened and I saw the rot beneath the floorboards. Karenza had been using HOA dues to lease her luxury SUV, treating the community reserve fund like her personal piggy bank. She was embezzling, plain and simple, a felony that carries real prison time. And when I dropped that audit on Bennett's desk during a deposition, the look of sheer terror on his face was worth every sleepless night. But instead of surrendering, instead of running, Karenza did what desperate animals do when they're cornered. She decided to burn the evidence and the accuser in one stroke. I found the final piece of the puzzle while reviewing the insurance policies she had taken out on the common areas. She had recently added a clause covering damage to adjacent structures caused by common area utility failures. My garage was exactly 6 feet from the community utility box. It was an elegant, evil plan. Trigger an electrical fire that starts in the common box, jumps to my garage, destroys the evidence of her harassment, burns my life to the ground, and pays out enough insurance money to cover the hole she'd blown in the HOA's bank account. I realized with a cold chill that I wasn't dealing with a nuisance neighbor anymore. I was dealing with a domestic terrorist in a cardigan. The date for the policy to become active was just 2 weeks away. I looked at the calendar, then at my camera feeds, and whispered to the empty room. Okay, Karenza, you want a war? Let's take this to federal court. Discovering a conspiracy to commit arson and insurance fraud is a heavy burden, the kind that sits in your gut like a stone. But as a judge, I knew that knowing it wasn't enough. I had to prove it, and I had to prove it so definitively that no high-priced lawyer could wiggle them out of it. I needed a team, so I called an old man Silas, the surveyor who had originally mapped the neighborhood and who despised Karenza for trying to bribe him years ago to falsify property lines. When I showed him the footage of Bennett tampering with the boundary stakes, pouring fresh concrete to make my garage look like it was encroaching, Silas spat on the ground and said, "Judge, I've been measuring dirt for 40 years, and I ain't never seen folks this dumb try to be this clever. Let's bury them." Next, I brought in Sergeant Miller, who brought the fire marshal and the fraud investigators into the loop. We turned my property into a fortress of surveillance, installing hidden, high-resolution cameras with night vision and high-gain microphones in the trees, under the eaves, even inside the faux rock near the utility box. We were building a movie set where Carenza and Bennett would be the unwitting stars of their own destruction. Brenda, the only board member with a conscience, turned informant, terrified that the woman she played bridge with was planning a felony, and she confirmed that Carenza had been buying copper wire, accelerants, and timing devices, creating a stockpile for the accident. The bait had to be irresistible, so I staged an elaborate departure, loading my truck with camping gear in broad daylight, telling everyone loud enough to hear that I was heading into the mountains for a 3-day digital detox. I moved my Camaro to Silas's secure barn under the cover of darkness, replacing it with a car cover draped over stacked boxes to create the silhouette of the vehicle. I wasn't about to let American muscle burn for the sake of justice. Driving away from my house, watching Carenza's curtains twitch as she verified my departure, I felt a sick mixture of adrenaline and dread, knowing I was leaving my home undefended to invite a monster in. But I didn't go to the mountains. I circled back and set up a command post in Silas's basement, surrounded by monitors glowing with the feeds from my hidden cameras. It was a high-tech stakeout in a suburban dungeon, smelling of stale coffee and Silas's pipe tobacco, waiting for the curtain to rise on the crime. The first night was quiet, agonizingly so, just the wind and the stray cats. But on the second night, the Saturday before the accident was scheduled, the players took the stage. At 1 a.m., the motion sensors tripped. Bennett and Carenza emerged from the shadows dressed in dark clothes, moving with the clumsy stealth of people whose only experience with crime came from television. The audio was crystal clear. I could hear the crunch of their shoes on the gravel and the whisper of Carenza hissing instructions, telling him to be careful with the wiring. They went straight for the community utility box, and the cameras captured Bennett fumbling with a ring of keys until he found the one that opened the panel, proof of premeditation and unauthorized access. For 45 minutes, we watched in silence as they rigged the box. Bennett wasn't just damaging it. He was installing a modified surge protector and bypassing the safety breakers, creating a deliberate overload that would superheat the wires running underground directly to my garage. It was a delayed action fuse. They were building a bomb out of electricity. Carenza stood lookout, checking her watch, and at one point, she walked over to my garage wall and poured a line of liquid from a water bottle along the foundation, accelerant, designed to catch the spark and guide the fire into the structure. I had Chloe Vance, an investigative journalist I knew from my days in the public defender's office, ready to break the story. She was practically vibrating with excitement when I texted her the update. The trap is set. They just planted the device. We had them on video committing breaking and entering, vandalism, and conspiracy, but the fire marshal insisted we wait. We need the attempt, he said. We need them to activate it. If we bust them now, they claim it was maintenance. If they flip the switch, it's attempted arson. Federal time. Sunday dragged on like a slow death. Carenza posted photos of herself at a brunch, smiling, clinking mimosa glasses, establishing her alibi, while the timer she helped set ticked down toward destruction. It was psychopathic behavior, a complete dissociation from the violence she was about to inflict. I sat in that basement, watching the clock, my stomach in knots, wondering if the fire crews positioned 2 streets away would really be fast enough to save the structure, or if I was watching the prologue to my own homelessness. 3:25 a.m., Monday morning. The 0 hour. The cameras switched to infrared as the timer inside the utility box clicked. We saw the spark first, a bright flare on the monitor, followed by the rapid heating of the wires. Smoke began to curl from the box, and the accelerant trail Carenza had laid started to shimmer with heat. This was it. I keyed the radio to Sergeant Miller. Ignition. Go. 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 It wasn't a fire, it was a raid. The suppression team didn't just roll up, they swarmed. They hit the utility box with chemical foam before the fire could jump the 6-foot gap to my garage, neutralizing the threat in seconds. Simultaneously, unmarked cars flooded the street, boxing in the escape routes. Bennett, who had returned to the scene to remove the evidence, once the fire started, was tackled before he could even unscrew the panel, caught literally red-handed with the timer in his grip. But the real prize was Carenza. She had driven up in her pajamas, feigning shock, ready to play the grieving neighbor. I watched on the monitor as she approached the police line, the perfect picture of concern, asking what happened. Sergeant Miller let her talk, let her dig the hole deeper, recording every lie on his body cam. And then, he nodded to his team. They didn't just ask her to step back, they spun her around. The look on her face when the cuffs clicked wasn't fear yet, it was indignation. She still thought she was in charge. She had no idea that the man she tried to burn out was about to become the man who signed her transfer to federal custody. The sunrise over Oak Ridge Heights that morning illuminated a scene that looked more like a federal crime drama than a suburban cul-de-sac. Crime scene tape fluttered in the breeze, marking the exact path where Carenza and Bennett had laid their chemical fuse, while arson investigators moved with surgical precision, bagging the timer, swabbing the accelerant, and collecting the modified electrical components. Carenza had been hauled off to county holding, screaming about her rights and demanding to speak to the manager of the police department, completely oblivious to the tsunami of evidence crashing down on her. Fast forward to 2 p.m. that same day. The arraignment docket. I sat in my chambers, adjusting my robe, feeling the smooth, heavy wood of the gavel in my hand. It wasn't revenge I was feeling, it was a profound, icy clarity. I walked into the courtroom, the bailiff cried out, "All rise," and the heavy oak doors swung open. Carenza was let in, wearing a bright orange jumpsuit that clashed violently with her furious complexion, shackles clinking around her ankles, a sound that replaced the click of her high heels. She looked at the floor, at her lawyer, at the gallery packed with the neighbors she had terrorized for years. Then, the clerk called the case. People versus Carenza Sterling, conspiracy to commit arson, insurance fraud, and federal civil rights violations. She looked up at the bench for the first time. The camera zoom on the courtroom feed caught the exact moment her soul left her body. Her eyes locked onto mine. She blinked. She squinted. And then, her mouth fell open in a silent scream of recognition. She realized that the new resident she had bullied, harassed, and tried to incinerate was the Honorable Judge Elias Thorne, the man holding her life in his hands. She physically collapsed, her knees hitting the floor, clutching the defense table like a drowning woman holding onto driftwood. A gasp rippled through the courtroom as the reality of the situation dawned on everyone. I kept my face stone cold, impartial, professional. "The defendant will rise," I said, my voice echoing with an authority she could never emulate with a clipboard. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I simply read the charges, listing the felonies one by one, watching the color drain from her face until she looked like a ghost. Due to the obvious conflict of interest, I recused myself immediately after the reading, transferring the case to Judge Abernathy, a man known for having zero tolerance for white-collar malice. But before I stepped down, I looked Carenza dead in the eye and said, "Miss Sterling, you sought to destroy a home to hide your greed. You will find that the architecture of justice is far harder to burn down than a garage." The fallout was nuclear. Bennett flipped on her in less than an hour, spilling everything about the embezzlement, the fake contractors, the insurance fraud scheme, all in exchange for a lighter sentence. Carenza got no such deal. The federal prosecutors, armed with my video evidence, the financial audits, and Bennett's testimony, tore her apart. She was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison, ordered to pay full restitution, and barred for life from ever holding a position of trust again. 6 months later, Oak Ridge Heights is a different world. Brenda took over the HOA and immediately dissolved the absurd rules, turning the board into a true community service. My garage stands tall, smelling of fresh pine and motor oil, hosting weekend workshops where I teach neighborhood kids how to change their oil and build birdhouses. The Camaro sits in the center bay, gleaming under the lights, a survivor of the war. As I stand here sanding down a piece of walnut, listening to the laughter of neighbors who used to be afraid to step outside, I realize that justice isn't just about punishment, it's about restoration. But it leaves me with a question for all of you watching. We like to think the system works, but if I hadn't been a judge, if I hadn't had the money for high-tech surveillance, if I hadn't known how to navigate the legal maze, would Carenza have won? How many petty tyrants are out there right now, burning down lives because their victims don't know how to fight back? Tell me in the comments, have you ever faced a bully with a badge, real or imagined? And what would you have done if you saw the person who burned down your dreams sitting on the judge's bench? Don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay vigilant. Because sometimes, The only thing standing between your home and a pile of ash is a well-placed camera and the courage to hold the line. Class dismissed.